I feel like I should do a really fancy intro for this, but I don't have one. It's just Ulysses, the video. That's it. I am still so humbled to be making this. So I started this channel 3 years ago, and I would qualify myself as a very beginner reader back then, and I would still probably say that now. I don't feel like an advanced reader at all. I'm slowly just bumbling my way through the classics and the things that people say that people need to read. And so I think if you'd asked me even 2 or 3 years ago if I would ever read Ulysses, I would have said probably not. And now to have finished it, not only do I not feel different, I feel like I kind of want to read it again. In fact, midway through reading this book, I wanted to read it again just because I didn't get that much out of it. But I was also still making sense of it. I think I'm really humbled by this. And it's difficult but accessible, it's complex, it's surprising and also in various ways kind of reprehensible. There is just so much to talk about it. I'm going to break it down to a few pieces. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to go just yet, so we'll see. Okay, so I'm going to go off my initial reaction to this novel. Just from the very beginning reading it, I was surprised that it was fairly accessible. Like, I was understanding most of the language. I think that if I had read less in the preparation for this, I maybe wouldn't have followed it as easily, but I kept finding myself actually understanding a lot of references because this book structurally borrows a lot from Hamlet, a lot from various classic works of English literature, and it uses those cultural monikers of Ireland in the 1900s. And I was kind of understanding it because I've read a good amount of Irish fiction at this point, and I've read the preceding James Joyce works, so I've read Dubliners and I've read Portrait of an Artless Young Man. They help a lot. I feel like I wasn't completely alone going to this book, and it also helps that Stephen Dedalus, who's one of the characters, he's not the main character, but he's in this book. A Portrait of the Artless Young Man is from the perspective of Stephen Dedalus, so reading this book and seeing whenever I saw Stephen's name, I was like, I know that guy. It's kind of like when you're at a party and you have one friend you're familiar with, so you feel a bit safer because when you're meeting strangers and you strike out, you can always go back to that one friend you know and you kind of follow them. There's some good parts about that, and this book is a ride. It's a huge ride. As I continued reading and as the styles just kept changing, as I don't want to say the plot developed because there isn't really a plot, but as the thematic content of it kept getting deeper and more complex, and it started taking me to all these various places within these characters' psyches and thoughts and histories and dreams, I was getting quite overwhelmed. I was getting to sections where I would just kind of glance over some pages and then realize that I haven't taken any information in, so I had to go back and then read them again. But as I was reading them, I would realize why I didn't take any information in, because the sentences were not complete, or the ideas would just go in these non sequiturs. It was still a lot. It's just a lot. I still feel like it's a lot. But ultimately, I feel quite rewarded. I am interested in the themes, and I think that the way that personal and social values intertwine with history and politics and literature and religion in this book is really fascinating. And whilst it's not a definitive representation of that, I think it's a very valiant effort to represent humanity. It, to me, almost feels like the author is just trying everything and seeing what works. The book just changes perspectives and styles and everything all the time, just to try and guess at how complex an individual human being can be. And yeah, it's cool, interesting. I also want to talk briefly about I don't want to call it prerequisite reading. I do honestly think you can go into Ulysses having read nothing, but there are definitely some works that, as I was reading this, I thought was very, very helpful for me to have read. Of course, I mentioned before, Dubliners and A Portrait of an Artless Young Man. Portrait of an Artist is useful because it has a lot of the similar styles and concerns as Ulysses. My edition actually didn't have any endnotes, but my edition of Portrait of an Artist definitely did. And so a lot of the Irish historical figures that I otherwise wouldn't have known about in Ulysses, I did learn about them in Portrait of an Artist, and so that was really helpful. Like I mentioned before too, Stephen Dedalus remains pretty consistent as a character. His values are something that remains constant across these two books, and so having Stephen Dedalus as an early character here was really, really helpful. Now, Dubliners, I was told that there's characters and Dubliners that appear in this novel. I didn't notice any, and potentially this is because I just didn't read very carefully. Maybe I missed some names because there are so many characters and Dubliners. At least it helped with the setting. So Dubliners to me is a very critically ordinary book. It has characters going through their ordinary day-to-days, and it doesn't feel particularly beholden to any narrative arcs. Like, not every story in Dubliners starts with a beginning and an ending, and a lot of the time the actual plot element of the story is omitted or alighted over. It's kind of talked about without being talked about. And so that primed me for a lot of the sections, in Ulysses, where similarly not that much was happening, but we got this texture of the city, and it also was useful to read Dubliners to see how Joyce improves and innovates as a writer. So Dubliners, to me, had a very straightforward and plain prose style, and Ulysses shows much more experimentation with poetics and sound. So all the sentences in Ulysses feel very constructed, even when it's just ordinary things happening to ordinary people. There are just more playful elements, things like sound effects and vernacular, and it's just more energetic, it's just more innovative in a way that Dubliners was more straightforward. So having all of that was really useful. Now, other books that I found incredibly useful for Ulysses, the Odyssey, sort of. I get that there's the schemata about mapping the different sections to sections of the Odyssey. It felt pretty hard for me to actually understand that. To me, it felt like the Odyssey was Joyce's tool in structuring this book. But for the average layperson, I don't think you're going to find a lot of connections between the Odyssey and these characters. Like, if I didn't know about the Odyssey and the schemata, I wouldn't have read this book and thought, oh, it's built around the Odyssey. Even if I had read the Odyssey, right? Like, that's just not really the most salient intertextual connection that I have here. It is sort of useful, and I do think that if you want to get to the level of understanding of Ulysses where you can understand every component of it and every reason of why it is the way it is, then the Odyssey is required reading, of course. But if you haven't read the Odyssey, you can jump into this, it's fine. But in terms of intertextual allusions that I do really think are crucial, number one is Hamlet. So Hamlet is structurally integral to, I think, at least 2 or 3 of the sections of Ulysses. Stephen Daedalus is a teacher and a scholar, and he talks a lot about Hamlet, and he has a lot of strong opinions about the narrative of Hamlet. And the characters of Hamlet also kind of get riffed on in some of the sections. So the core themes of Hamlet, of just being a human being, like what does it mean to be a human being, to self-actualize, to have your own values and beliefs, to be in control of your own destiny, some of those questions are very strongly raised in Ulysses as well, and so Hamlet is a really useful touch point to me. I'm not super familiar with Hamlet, so I've read it maybe 6 or 7 years ago, before my Shakespeare literacy was particularly high, so I think that there's lots of things from that play that I would have missed out on. But I think the discussions of personhood and performance and all of that, it's hard to ignore. It's very, very present in this book, to the point where I think having knowledge of Hamlet was really useful. The other book that I would say to have knowledge of is the Bible. So the entirety of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the little finicky bits in terms of its, Christian dominations between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the various little things that differentiate these denominations. I happen to know that from reading the Bible, and also from my own personal knowledge and reading and understanding, that made some of the sections just way easier. So this book does get into those finicky details of religion and spirituality, and not knowing those specifics and not knowing general biblical references, a lot of that will go over your head. I just think that volume-wise, so many of the intertextual allusions in this book are biblical that if you have read the Bible, it will make it much easier to understand Ulysses. Same with everything else I've mentioned so far. I don't think it's crucial. If you haven't read the Bible, or if you don't have biblical knowledge, it's not as if you'll miss things in Ulysses, or more correctly, I think you're going to miss things in Ulysses. Everyone's going to miss things in Ulysses, and you will miss things, but you won't miss the feeling or the point. Like, I feel like everybody's going to miss something in Ulysses. The missing things is part of the point, so it's totally fine if you haven't read the Bible. But the thing that I think helped me the most reading this work is having read a work of modernist stream of consciousness literature. So Ulysses is quite well known for pioneering the stream of consciousness style. Most of the sections in this book have some degree of stream of consciousness in them, but I would never recommend anybody to start their modernist journey with Ulysses. I think that the experimentation within the stream of consciousness voice in this novel means that some of the sections won't work and they just won't feel intuitive. It's very, very easy to miss things, and the stream of consciousness here is an intense flavor to the point where you sometimes feel like you're not supposed to understand these characters. That's just how complex the human consciousness is that it's just too much. The very final section is very famously one of those stream of consciousness monologues that is just impossibly difficult to follow. It's really, really hard to follow. And what I would recommend instead is reading a shorter, more concise, and more direct work that uses elements of stream of consciousness. So the work that I thought really was helpful and that I would recommend to new readers as well is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Lots of things that can be said about the relationship between Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway. I'm going to put the whole thing about Irish culture and British culture and English culture into a box and move that box away, because you can see from my face and my nationality I don't know a lot about that, right? So I'm not going to say anything about that authoritatively, but I do think stylistically Mrs. Dalloway is really interesting in terms of its relationship to Ulysses, because Mrs. Dalloway is kind of like Virginia Woolf reading Ulysses and going, hold my beer, and writing her version. So if Ulysses can be described as a full life of a man in a day, Mrs. Dalloway is the full life of a woman in a day. But Mrs. Dalloway is a fraction of the length. It uses similar techniques, but more consistently throughout the novel. It has those stream of consciousness elements, and it is just... I don't want to say it's easy, because Mrs. Dalloway is still one of the hardest books I've ever read, but once you get that book, this book is a lot easier to get. You kind of see what's being attempted in the various different forms of stream of consciousness after seeing another author use it for a very direct purpose. Because Mrs. Dalloway, for all you can say about it, at the end of the day, is quite neat and quite purposeful, and the use of stream of consciousness has clarity there, where in Ulysses sometimes it doesn't. So that's what was really helpful to me. But there's lots of other modernist works that use stream of consciousness that is a good starting point, so that you kind of understand how it feels to read it, and how it feels to be a bit disorientated, and to be put in that position as a reader where you're trying to make a decision between, do I want to interpret this, or am I supposed to feel lost? That was a very good guiding point for Ulysses. Aside from that, I've mentioned a lot of books. You can read these if you want. You don't have to read these. It depends on how much you want to understand and how much you want to enjoy this book from the very first time you read it, and how much you're okay with tolerating the feeling of not being fully in on the joke. I don't know. It is what it is. I think anyone can start this book whenever you want, and as intimidating as it looks and sounds, you can just grab it and start reading. Like, it's not impossible. I can't really remember a world anymore where I haven't read the books that I mentioned, so that's something that has always been helpful to me and will affect the way that I've interpreted this. Could I have read more, understood more? Probably. Would I have understood as much as I did if I read less? Probably not. But would I recommend anyone who wants to try Ulysses to give it a go regardless of what you have read before? Yes. I would not say that there is a list of things that you must read before you start this book, but the more you know, the easier it gets, and the more you'll get out of it for the first read through. So I'm going to try my best to do a chapter summary of this thing. It is not going to go well, but we'll do our best. So just in reading Ulysses, it is difficult because there are 18 chapters, and each chapter is in a slightly different textual style, but they are not named chapters, and it's, to be honest, not clear when a chapter begins or ends. So what you're looking for in your edition is literally just well, mine has these 5 stars. Different editions have different indicators for when the chapters begin, but they are not named in any printed copy of Ulysses. You're supposed to figure out what the names are by researching. So these chapter names are from the schema. So when James Joyce was describing this book to his friends and trying to explain how it worked for people to write lectures about it. He named each of them based on a plot element from the Odyssey. And so these are the names of the chapters that you'll probably find online. If you're trying to read the book online, you'll see links to each of those. They do kind of help in clarifying the links to the Odyssey and also exactly what happens in each one, but those links, in my opinion at least, and I feel like a lot of scholarships like this as well, is quite tenuous. It's not like a direct one-to-one, this is the link to the Odyssey. Instead, it's more of a structural thing, so it guides the reader's understanding, or the writer's understanding, as they produce it. It informs some of the creative choices that are made. And so, I would strongly recommend when you read just to be aware when you're leaving one section and entering another, because at times the stylistic shifts are very abrupt and hard to follow, and knowing what one particular section is trying to do is useful in grasping how it fits into the larger picture. I also think of Ulysses as a book in kind of two-ish sections. I know officially it has 3 sections, but I think of it as more of like a day-night thing. So the day side of Ulysses is very ordinary, is very clear about the setting of Dublin, and the night part of Ulysses is wild and out there and is more internal and psychological and deviant. So we'll go chapter by chapter. Hopefully this helps somebody. I don't know, this barely helps me. In order to make this video, I did a lot more research. I had to go back to each of the chapters and try to figure out what was happening. I think I understand the book a lot better having done so. So really, if not for nothing else, it's for my benefit. So chapter 1 of this book is called Telemachus, and that's a connection to the Odyssey, where Telemachus is the son of Odysseus, and the novel begins with the main character's son going out on this journey, or at least just deciding to go on a journey to find his father who's gone missing. So I'm not going to be so clear with every single Odyssey connection, but I think it's relevant here because just as how Telemachus is not the real protagonist of the Odyssey, but is the thing that started off, Stephen Aeolus is who we see first in Telemachus, the chapter in Ulysses, and he's not the real protagonist of this novel either, but he is the one that's introduced to us first, having this conversation with another man named Buck Mulligan. They're having this conversation by the seaside, talking about very ordinary things in Dublin, just life and rent and ordinary day-to-day things. Stephen is a familiar character if you've read Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, so I was quite comfortable and confident seeing him there, whereas Buck Mulligan, he's described very easily, so he's kind of a boorish figure, funny dialogue, easy to get into, and so I was lulled into a false sense of security with this first chapter. I thought that the words and the grammar, the vernacular was pretty easy to follow. It was quite ordinary to me, almost comfortable in a way, and we're about to depart from this. Chapter 2, Nestor, we see Stephen teaching a class, and he's trying to explain elements of world history to his class. Then we have a conversation with his staff at school. We learn a bit more about the world of Dublin, and we see things start to develop. I actually, when I started reading this, I wasn't aware of this schemata, and so I wasn't aware that chapter 2, Nestor, is separate from chapter 1. It just felt like a easy flow-on thing. I also didn't notice the style's supposed to be different. 1 and 2, so Telemachus and Nestor, are both kind of just simple, straightforward, third-person prose. It was easy to follow, and I knew the character, so I was just kind of breezing through it. Chapter 3 is called Proteus, and this is where things start to get a little bit weird, and we begin the journey proper. So we just have a scene of Stephen Aeolus walking down the street, or walking along the beach, I think, and it gets really sensory. Like, the actual descriptions start to take on a more poetic sense, where the sounds of the words start to matter, and it just is quite pleasant and pleasurable to hear in your head, but at the same time, this is done at the expense of actual comprehensibility. So far nothing so much has happened, nothing really important has happened, but we're starting to get a taste of what this novel is going to be like, where things start to go off the rails and it's a bit hard to understand what's going on. So just reading from some of the words reading from some of the first lines in Proteus, I don't even know how to pronounce that. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that if no more, thought through my eyes. Signature of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust-coloured signs, limits of the diaphane. But he adds, in bodies, that he was aware of them bodies before them coloured. How? By knocking his sconce against them, sure. Go easy. Bold he was, and a millionaire. Maestro de color de sano. Limits of the diaphane in. Why in? diaphen, adiaphen. If you can put 5 fingers through it, it is a gate, if not a door. Shut your eyes and see. Like, it's sonic. It's something that is pleasant to hear, but at the same time, it's using a lot of these technical, scientific, other languages to try and represent the intelligence of Stephen Daedalus, and that's quite distancing for most readers. Like, having read that first passage, I still don't know what some of those words mean, and if you're reading an edition that has a glossary, you may be very tempted to look at every footnote and try to figure out what everything means. I would strongly recommend avoiding that. In fact, I was so thankful that my edition doesn't have an endnote or a glossary. I could just go straight forward, and if anything didn't make sense, I could think, well, maybe it's there for the sound, right? If I don't know what that word means, maybe it's pleasant in terms of its oral qualities, and I know what's happening right now as it's just going for a walk on the coastline, so it's not really high stakes, right? I'm not going to miss a big plot point. I can just kind of enjoy it and let it wash over me. So those 3 chapters form part 1 of Ulysses, and this is where I started getting really confused, is because part 2 of Ulysses is by far the longest part, and it follows Leopold Bloom. So in my edition, what happened is there was a number at the start, and I had thought that this meant we're entering a new chapter or section, and then I thought maybe the style is supposed to be different. I didn't realize that it already passed 3 sections, Telemachus, Nestor, and Proteus, before getting here. But section 4 is called Calpyso, and here we meet Leopold Bloom, who is our real protagonist. He is a Jewish man, he's getting a bit older, he's married to a woman named Molly, and he is something of a disappointing fellow. So Joyce seems to make fun of him every now and then with very, I don't want to say self-deprecating because it's not him that's writing it or thinking it, but just little unpleasant moments that don't make us hate him, but we do kind of pity him and feel sorry for him. This first section just shows his morning routine, getting up, eating some food, saying goodbye to his wife who's cheating on him, and he's sorting through his mail, saying hi to his daughter, and leaving to go for a day of work. It's a normal situation, except for the whole cheating thing, I guess, and it's not too difficult to follow. The plot points about Leopold Bloom will eventually unfold later on, but it's good to know who he is, what kind of person he is, and to have some kind of relationship with him, or understanding of how you feel about him. Number 5 is called the Lotus Eaters. This is a moment where Bloom is walking down the street and is just constantly getting distracted. This is difficult to read because there's so many cultural artifacts in this section where things that are very true to life to Dublin in the era were being described, I feel like, as a kind of genius bonus to people who have been there and have experienced that. They can walk the same street that Leopold Bloom walks down and point to things and go, hey, that's exactly how James Joyce described it. There's lots of real-life businesses that get described in the section, and we start to see this pattern where a number of chapters are just going to be characters walking down the street, but in an incredibly sensorial way, just describing all the sights and sounds and every thought they have along the way, the interiority of their mind combined with just this incredible eye for detail for the streets. It is not fun to read, but it is still just a demonstration of the author's skill, and yeah, it's fine. It wasn't too hard to read, I just kept moving at this point. This was around about 100 pages into the novel, and I was just locked in, right? I was going to keep going. If anything was going to, well, nothing was going to stop me. If I hit a roadblock, I would just push past it and keep reading. If I didn't understand the part, I would just let it wash over me, and this is what was happening so far. Chapter 6 is called Hades. This one is a quite meandering meditation on death. So what happens is Bloom and a number of other figures, including Simon Daedalus, who is Stephen's father, they get together in this carriage to go to a funeral for Paddy Dignam. And as this is happening, we get glimpses into all of their heads to think about what their reaction is to this experience of death. We also see this carriage move along Dublin and continue this eye for detail that all the streets and surroundings have, but because they're discussing the funeral arrangements, all of the description is kind of colored by this feeling of gloom, and it was interesting seeing that shift as it developed. Now there's lots of side characters that we see and we pass as well, but overall what's happening is just this funeral and the psychological complexity of all the characters experiencing it. Number 7, Aeolus. So here is where the forms start to get played with a little bit, because this section is written like a newspaper. It has headlines, and each of those little sections is describing the the hustle and bustle of a print shop. So what's happening here is Leopold Bloom wants to go put an ad in a newspaper, but we don't see him directly. Instead, we view the various workers at this print shop, we see the little vignettes of what they're up to, and there's lots of just little jokes scattered around this section that are quite funny if you have the patience for that, I guess, because it's very long and nothing much is happening. But eventually we see Bloom come in, he's made fun of a bunch again, and that's this section. It's Aeolus. The next section is called Lestrygonians. So in the Odyssey, the Lestrygonians were a race of giants, and it was one of the many trials that Odysseus had to overcome in his journey to go back to Ithaca. So a lot of these sections, at least in the daytime ones, are named after particular moments in the Odyssey. So it doesn't go by chapter. Instead, it's one particular trial or temptation faced by Odysseus. And so in the Lestrygonians, this is just Bloom being very hungry and needing to find a place to eat. So he's wandering down the streets and he's thinking about food all the time. He eventually finds a spot in a pub. He settles down to have a meal. He overhears some conversations of people around him, and that's kind of it. This is Lestrygonians. Meanwhile, so the last couple of chapters have been following Leopold Bloom. I forgot to explain how the time of this novel works as well. It takes place over the entire day, but it's not strictly linear, so the very first chapters featuring Stephen take us through the morning, and then when we get to Leopold Bloom in chapter 4, we actually go back in time to see how he experienced the morning in contrast to Stephen. None of this is really explained, like there's a few monikers that you're supposed to latch onto to figure out what time it is, but it's not as if every chapter has a timestamp on it. So lots of different scholars have tried to work out when each section happens based on things like the sun or bells ringing or any kind of thing that happens on a particular time basis. But anyways, as we get through to the next section, which is Scylla Charybdis, we now jump back to Stephen Daedalus. So whilst Leopold Bloom is eating the sandwich in Lestrygonians, in Scylla Charybdis, Stephen is at a library giving a lecture about Hamlet, and it's quite a complex treatise on Shakespearean themes, combining lots of things from his other plays and from the Bible and lots of other works of literature. So this is just kind of James Joyce nerding out and talking about how much he likes literature. Stephen Daedalus from Portrait of an Artist was written as a kind of author surrogate, right? So we see elements of that coming out here, that Stephen just wants to be heard and wants to prove himself to be very intelligent. And I felt very rewarded reading this section because having read Hamlet and having read a number of Shakespeare plays, I could understand it, but I could also understand that it's written to be difficult. So the interpretations here maybe feel smart, and sometimes that's a good thing, right? So if you've done the prior readings for Ulysses and you can read through Scylla and Charybdis, it's cool, it's interesting. The next chapter is Wandering Rocks. Now this one it's been described as a kind of microcosm of Ulysses, because what happens here is that we jump into the heads of a number of figures across Dublin. Some of them are our characters and some of them aren't, and we just see them go about their day-to-day. It feels a lot like reading Dubliners again, where we get these snapshots into people's lives, and it's a kind of break from the very high-minded intellectual parts of the novel. This one wasn't too hard to follow, although it is still a bit psychological. The fact that it's divided into vignettes or sections, so the way that it's done in my edition actually has stars between the sections. It has these little single stars, and so some sections are about a page or two long. They're just these small moments in people's lives, and it wasn't too hard to follow. It was just a nice reprieve. Chapter 11, now we're moving from daytime to nighttime. This next chapter is called Sirens, and it's a direct continuation from Wandering Rocks, but it is also much harder to follow. So Sirens is inspired by music and sound, and so it starts with a lot of onomatopoeia that is just confusing, trying to figure out what the city sounds like, and the city's winding down. And then we eventually go into discussions about music. We start to incorporate Leopold Bloom again. We see his evening, but all of this is in conversations about sound and music. And it's pretty complicated. Like, it's got a lot of things that I didn't quite grasp here, and I'll be honest, I let this chapter wash over me much more than some of the others. Chapter 12 is Cyclops. Now, here's where things get a bit weird. Cyclops is from the perspective of a unnamed narrator, and it's someone who is sitting there in the bar that Leopold Bloom is in, kind of witnessing the conversation unfold. So nothing about this book tells us that this is what's happening. When this chapter starts in first person, we don't really know who that first person is, and it's really owing to the work of a lot of scholars to try and figure out the fact that this is an unknown narrator, but they have certain qualities to them. They're talking to somebody who will eventually get in an argument with Bloom, and that person is also unnamed, only called the Citizen, and is apparently a parody of a particular Irish politician or something of the time. I'm not entirely sure, but things get really anti-Semitic. So Leopold Bloom is Jewish, and the Citizen here ends up in an argument with Leopold about his worth and value as a human being because he's Jewish, and starts to talk a bit more about the nature of foreigners in Ireland as well. It's a lot, and it's pretty hard to follow. Doesn't help by the fact that for some reason in this chapter we get giant interruptions or tangents from a different voice, and it's just these long-winded descriptions or lists of names or other weird things. So every now and then we're just kind of whipped out of the scene and then into something else, and then back into the conversation. There's no signaling or rhyme or rhythm to these interruptions. They just kind of happen, and it's just something you have to deal with as you read this. It's not one of my favorite sections, not at all. Chapter 17 is called Nausicaa. This is probably the one that people know the most if you think about Ulysses. So the plot of Ulysses is that not very much happens, and at some point Leopold Bloom publicly masturbates. And so Nausicaa is the story of that. We have 3 young women who are at the beach just watching the coastline, and this is now evening, so the sun is set, or the sun is currently setting. These 3 young women are represented by the narrator as objects of sexual desire. It's very male-gazy, the way that they are represented in their conversations, and they're talking to one another. And so one of the women, her name's, I want to say Sissy. Okay, I was wrong. So Sissy is one of the characters, but Gertie is the one that's mentioned more in this chapter. What happens is Gertie is kind of sitting there thinking about her role and status as a young woman in Dublin, and then realizes that she's being watched, and it's by Leopold Bloom. Leopold Bloom is kind of enraptured by this picture of femininity before him, and so in somewhat veiled language, you kind of know it's there if you're told it's there, but the first time I read this, I did definitely miss it. Leopold Bloom masturbates publicly, and so Gertie is aware of this, and this is some kind of psychological connection between them. And there is debate about how much of this is reality and how much of this is dream or hallucination. Joyce, I think, has said that the whole chapter is dream, but different scholars say different things. I didn't like this. I thought that the representation of the women here is really colored through a man's viewpoint, especially like a straight man's viewpoint. It's very desirous to the point where I don't think that any of these 3 women feel real. They feel like objects of desire, and physical desire at that. And I think that's probably intentional on part of James Joyce to try and criticize that masculine attitude. But I also don't know. I think there's just too much in the way here that I can't make an easy interpretation. But it does happen, and it does really negatively color my opinion of Leopold Bloom, even though he's someone to feel sorry for, even though he's someone that has a lot of misfortunes currently happening to him. He just seems really pathetic coming up in this chapter, even as the women aren't represented in particular psychological complexity. Just the attitude he has towards them, just a bit sad, just a bit sad. The next section is called Oxen of the Sun. In the Odyssey, the Oxen of the Sun is a cautionary tale where Ulysses, or Odysseus, and his shipmates are in this island. They're warned not to go to this island, but they go there anyway. And they're also warned not to touch the cattle there, but they do anyway. And because of this, they're horribly punished for it. Odysseus being the only person to say, hey, let's not touch the cattle, he's the only one who survives. So this section has Leopold Bloom visiting a hospital, a maternity ward, and at the same time, Stephen Daedalus and a bunch of his friends are there. They're there to witness, I guess. It's kind of unclear. To witness a woman named Mina Ponfroy give birth. Why they're there, I didn't really catch. And also, this chapter is known as the most difficult one in Ulysses. So what James Joyce is doing here is that he's parodying all of English literature from the beginning of the English language up until the writing of this book. And so the style of writing is going to constantly shift. At the very beginning, it starts with Latin chanting and incorporates a lot of untranslated Latin, untranslated French. The plot here is not very important, and we don't really revisit this section very much. It's not really explained who Mina Pomfroy is or why she's important. It's only that these characters are there, and that Stephen Daedalus and his friends are just making a ruckus in this maternity ward, just making absolute fools of themselves. And even that to me wasn't very clear. Like, I'm going to be honest, this section completely washed over me. I didn't take in very much of it at all. It's still rhythmic, it's still kind of pleasurable from a sonic perspective, but I was ready to move on at this point. This happens to be about halfway through the book, and I was really excited for the next section. So section number 15, called Circe, it's a script. It's a entire play script with stage directions and characters speaking, and I knew there was going to be a script because I'd flicked through the book on a cursory glance when I first picked it up, and I was excited for that because some of the hardest parts of this book for me so far was the descriptions of places and characters' thoughts. And I thought, if it's a script, well, it's going to be dialogue, so it's probably not going to be as difficult, right? Oh boy, I was so wrong. So Circe is very, very challenging. It is Stephen Daedalus and Leopold Bloom visiting the red light district together. Stephen is really drunk still, and so Leopold Bloom is kind of being the voice of reason here. But as this is happening, Leopold has these hallucinations of a sense. So he visits this brothel owned by Madame Bella, and he interacts with some of the workers there, and as this is happening, he has strange, crazy dreams of him owning city and being put on trial and changing gender and a lot of other different things. And you're supposed to understand that they're dreamscape, but they slide between dream and reality so much that sometimes you'll read a page or two and go, I don't know where I am, I don't know what's happening. The stage directions are all very surreal, the dialogue is all very surreal. It's incredibly hard to follow. It feels quite nightmarish, and it operates on that kind of dream logic where when you're in the middle of the dream, everything kind of makes sense and you can follow along. But after the fact, you go back and you think about what you really experienced, and you go, actually, none of that makes sense, and I don't follow that. This is how I feel about this, right? Like, sometimes I can envisage the dialogue in my head and the conversation in my head, the stage directions, and think, yeah, that's happening. And then I go back and go, wait a minute, this was supposed to be a realistic book. This is supposed to make sense. Well, maybe not the second part, but this was supposed to be something I could follow. And instead, what's happening here is just really strange, archetypal, weird sex things. And I feel like if I really took the time for it and tried to work the session out, I could. And maybe I'd want to do that for Oxen of the Sun as well. But just reading through it and trying to get through it, I was like, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it means something to somebody. I don't know. Okay, we're getting towards the end of it, so now we've left section 2, we've entered section 3. We're going to wrap up this novel. Next section is called Eumaeus, and this is corresponding to the part in the Odyssey where Odysseus arrives back in Ithaca and meets a man named Eumaeus, and they decide to not reveal Odysseus' identity just yet, but instead just try and wait until the time is right. And so in this section, it's kind of like the bumbling walk home of Stephen Daedalus and Leopold Bloom, where both of them, well, Stephen's really drunk, and they're going to walk to Leopold's house. He's trying to take care of him, and they're getting accosted by police and need to identify themselves. And it just feels really groggy in this sense. It's hard to follow what's going on. And although it's a relief from the play section, which was absolutely off the wall crazy, this section is a bit more normal. We do feel a bit weary, and it's late at night. That's what I got from the section. Ithaca is the second last part of the novel. I really liked this. So this is the narrative of Leopold inviting Stephen in to have a cup of coffee and a nightcap, try and sober up a little bit before he goes to bed. It's really late at night, and it's written as a catechism. So This is very common in various church histories. A catechism is a question and answer format that explains the beliefs of the church. So it will explain things like the doctrine of who God is and what do they believe. But here, the catechism is trying to describe what's happening as Leopold Bloom and Stephen arrive at the house. And it is so funny. It's so funny to have this very serious and formal structure being applied to just this absolute bumbling fool trying to break into his own house because he doesn't have the keys, and then trying to make a cup of coffee but hitting himself on the windowsill, and then having like a literal pissing contest in the backyard. And the question and answer format is trying to describe the arc and the parabola of the piss. Like, it's just so absurd. And it's just this nice fitting conclusion for the narrative of Stephen and Leopold, in that they're kind of kindred spirits now. They've gone through hell and they've come back out, and they know each other a little bit better. They feel comfortable with each other, and Stephen eventually decides to go home, and Leopold goes back to bed to sleep. The last chapter, Penelope, is one of the more famous ones in this book. So in Penelope, it is a completely unbroken stream of consciousness thought process from Molly, who is Leopold's wife. We don't really hear that much of her throughout the narrative, but we know that she's been unfaithful to Leopold, and this dream monologue is going through her various life experiences, her various romantic partners, and then finishing on this declaration of loyalty and romantic desire towards Leopold. I don't really know this one. I didn't get it. There's no full stops at all in this section, and so I had a hard time reading it. I thought that as you read it, your brain is supposed to put in the full stops for the thought process, but I just didn't. Like, to me, Ithaca was a really nice ending. It wrapped everything up nicely in a bow. The Penelope section is kind of like a victory lap. It's like, if you understood this so far, then you'll definitely get this. And for what it's worth, I do think it's nice that they gave Molly a lot of psychological complexity, and there's definitely moments here that are really rousing in their emotional clarity, but in order to get there, you need to do a lot of work to just try and figure out what's being said, and it jumps across topics so much. It's just a lot. And that is all 18 chapters of Ulysses. Oh my goodness, it took so long. I'm massively simplifying things here, and there's so many more connections to find if a reader is keen to do so. I think I'm done for now, though. I think maybe later in my life, after I've finished my reading of Shakespeare and after I know the world better, I know Ireland better, maybe if I've even visited Ireland and walked the same streets of the novel, then maybe I would be able to read it again and understand more. But I can say, having finished this, I understand so little. I understand barely anything, and I can say that I've finished it, and I can say what each of these chapters are supposed to mean, and then I can flick to a page and still not know anything. So I was supposed to do a summary of what I think the themes of the book are, and I cannot begin at all. I can only think and theorize and postulate that it is about humanity and our psychology, our relationship with the society around us, in a very, very specific time in Dublin, which was marred by political instability and religious disputes, other questions about migration. It is not a universal text by any means. It is so clearly fixated on this time and place that you need to know about it if you want to get everything out of it. But it's also a confounding book. I think it's a book that reflects on knowledge and what we know and what the relevance of that is. So much of it is filled with random facts that I feel like only James Joyce would have known, and he's very lucky to be an author that is so respected and revered that people will go through the work to try and figure out what each of these references is. But even then, it's going to take ages and ages to do it, and Joyce himself mentioned that it'll take centuries to try and unpack it all, right? He is writing to demonstrate his intellect for fun, and what value that has lies in the reader, I guess. I can also make lots of criticisms of it. If you are not a fan of a person demonstrating their intellect in this writing style, then you're not going to like it. And it's a lot of work for... Your mileage may vary. Like, if you give it value, and if you treat it as difficult, and you meet the challenge, then it will give you something to to puzzle over and to test yourself on. Like, there's definitely lots of chapters where I felt incredibly rewarded for having known what I did and having been able to figure out something about these characters. But if you like your fiction to be more straightforward, this is not it for you. This is a book that sets a challenge, and if you're not interested in that challenge, it's a very specific challenge, then it's just not a good time. And there's sections of this that I still haven't really plumbed the depths of, and I may one day, like maybe one day I can say I understand Oxen of the Sun, but I just don't. It was too much for me. It was too difficult for me. And it's hard for me to make a judgment on the book's values regarding race and gender, because first of all, it is a book of its time, but also I feel like James Joyce has a very parodic voice across this book. He makes fun of a lot of things and a lot of attitudes, and it's quite hard for me to interpret the racism and sexism of this book as any kind of endorsement. But it is still quite an abrasive read because of it. It does contain a lot of those stereotypes and assumptions from that era, and it has to be read in context, but it's not something that you would pick up lightly. And yet, despite saying that, I think that should people go out and read Ulysses, I think the answer is yes. I think that it does hold a place within today's literary landscape. It is so unique for what it is, and I can see parts of its influence in other books that I really enjoy. I know a lot of authors that I particularly admire went through the journey of reading Ulysses and came out the other side more enlightened and loving it. So I do think it's a worthwhile book. I do think it's a very particular book if you are the kind of person who hears a chapter somewhere like that and goes, I want to figure that out, then this will be a very worthwhile challenge for you. But it is easily the hardest book that I've read, harder than Gravity's Rainbow, harder than Midnight's Children, harder than anything else I've read, right? And that's it, that's Ulysses. That's the last I'll be talking about this for a while. Okay, so I really want to find out what to read next. It is almost the end of October as I'm recording this, and I've almost finished my books of October, which means that I will have some time this month to start one more final boss, and it wouldn't feel right if my final bosses this year was The Lord of the Rings, The Iliad, The Odyssey, and Ulysses. 4 books. Well, technically 6, I guess, but still, wouldn't feel right. So I'm going to try and do one last one. Depending on what I get, it may be that my November is just entirely War and Peace, who knows? But I will spin the wheel, and whatever it gives me, I will look at. The options are Anna Karenina, Count of Monte Cristo, Faulkner Duology, so that's The Sound of the Fury and Absalom, Middlemarch, Suitable Boy, Vanity Fair, Blood Meridian, War and Peace, Luminaries, which is the longest Booker Prize novel, and the Brothers Karamazov. There's probably a lot more. There's The Master and Margarita, which I bought that I didn't put on this list, lots of other things. But these are the ones that I'm pretty intent on wanting to finish at least one of this year. Some of these are extremely long, much longer than Ulysses, so we'll see. I'll adapt my reading year based on what I get. Let's spin a wheel. Okay, yeah, look, I'm very okay with this. I think that Anna Karenina, I have friends who have read it. I'm aware of its history and its legacy. It's not War and Peace. So I'm excited. I can give it a go. I'm ready to get it started and seeing what happens. I don't know very much about it, but I also know some people who have read it and just absolutely loved it. Favorite book of all time. So yeah, let's give it a go. So this one is my copy of Anna Karenina. Look, it's just such a beautiful, gorgeous edition. So I actually got this one from my friend as a gift because I've made a purchase from my bookstore and she just kind of chucked it in. It is a really, really wonderful edition. It is translated by, I've forgotten their names, but I know Louise and Alma Maud. Okay, never mind. I don't know who these people are. I've never read anything by them. I don't know what the translation is like, but it is what is currently on my shelf, so it is what I'm going to read, and if it is not a good edition, then we will find out afterwards. It is... let's see. Is it 963 pages? So pretty long. And yeah, we'll make it work. I can see the chapter lengths are pretty short, which is good. I'm hoping that it's going to feel a little bit like Dickensian, where it's just trudging on bit by bit. It's not going to be structurally so experimental and difficult that Ulysses was. And I don't even need to open the book to know what the first line is. It's such an iconic first line. All happy families are alike. All unhappy families... well... never mind, I don't remember it. Something, all unhappy families are unlike differently, something like that. I know the idea behind it, now I'm gonna have to read it, oh no. All happy families resemble one another, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This is different to the translation that I'm familiar with, but that's fine, it's okay. We'll give it a go, and hopefully in December at some point we will catch up and see how anachronistic it is. Okay, thank you for joining, I will see you next time.